and we're at the hour. So I think we can get started. What do you think, Amber?
Yeah, I think that sounds great.
Perfect. I know we have a great presentation today. So hi, everyone. Welcome to Maddie's Fun Community Conversations. We're so glad you can join us today. I'm one of your hosts, Sheila Kukan, and I'm really excited to be back here with Amber Evie, my colleague, as my co-host today. Amber is the Senior Grant Specialist for Maddie's Fund, working with organizations applying for grants and also helps spread awareness about Maddie and Maddie's Fund. Prior to her role here at Maddie's Fund, she spent 9 years on the adoptions team at the San Francisco SPCA. Amber started as an adoption associate, became adoptions coordinator, and was then promoted to the adoptions manager of the Pacific Heights SF SPCA. Originally from Michigan, Amber graduated from Grand Valley State University with a degree in creative writing. She currently lives in this California Central Valley with her husband Chris and their 3 cats, Dottie Doomsday and the Twinkies Nosy and Tozy, and hospice foster from Muttville, Dolly Rotten, a tiny Chihuahua mouse combination, who I really hope makes an appearance today. Amber will be joining me throughout the year, occasionally as co-host, so I'm really happy that you'll be joining me more than once, Amber, but everyone please join me in welcoming Amber as my co-host today.
Hey everyone, good morning. And I do have Tessie Tozy right here. She'll probably pop her head up in a little bit, but I'm so excited to be hosting this call with Sheila and to see all of you in this morning or afternoon. And let's go ahead and get started with the question of the day. So we're going to drop it in the chat. So we'd love to hear from you in the chat. What's your favorite spot in your workplace to catch your breath? And this is going to go great with our conversation today about, taking care of ourselves and taking time to focus. So, Sheila, what's your favorite spot to catch your breath?
I feel so grateful that I get to work from home, but I love to catch my breath right there in that human-sized dog bed with my dog Ziba. Although usually when I go in, she leaves, but Jerry will join me in there. But it's super cozy, and sometimes I'm like, oh, it's just so big and takes over the room, but it's totally worth it to be able to just sit there, catch a breath, read a book. But I love it. What about you, Amber?
Oh my gosh, that looks like the comfiest spot for sure. I do think working from home is something to be super grateful for if you have that part-time or, all the time. But for me, no matter where you're working, going outside is key. I love being able to have fresh air. I love the change in environment, and I'm a person who'd much rather be outside than inside. So just having that break to look at the nature, to look at the cityscape, whatever it is you're surrounded by, can be so recharging and just resetting. Oh yeah, I see on screen porch when the weather is nice, and also someone else who wants to be in their dog bed.
It looks like nature is definitely a common thread here. I agree.
Mm.
Nature is just so healing, and it's nice to pause and take a breath outdoors.
Swimming too. There's folks going to the Y and folks who are have their own pools that they get to go outside under the trees, outside in the sunshine, mountain air. I love this. Going outside, going home and petting my kitties.
Oh, Brandy, I don't think it sounds weird to say your bathroom at all. I think there's something so beautiful in like a little routine and ritual for yourself. Well, I think this is amazing. Everyone, please keep them coming. It's so nice to hear about where we're all taking a breath and maybe inspire some ideas for each other. And as you're doing so, if anyone has any national updates, please go ahead and drop them in the chat now. We can also share them on Maddie's Pet Forum, and we'll drop the chat for that thread in as well.
Excellent. Looking forward to seeing more of your suggestions about where to take a break and any national updates. But in the meantime, let's go ahead. And the reason why we're all here, I'm so excited to introduce Raquel Bernaldo for our speaker today. Raquel Bernaldo is the veterinary social worker at Alameda Animal Shelter, where she integrates animal welfare with human well-being through direct support, program development, and community collaboration. With over a decade of experience in social work and animal welfare, Raquel brings a unique blend of clinical skills and leadership to her role. Since 2016, Raquel has specialized in crisis intervention, grief counseling, and staff and volunteer supervision within shelter and veterinary settings. Her previous leadership roles at Pets Are Wonderful Support at Shanti Project and East Bay SPCA focus on supervising teams, expanding access to veterinary resources, and building partnership with organizations such as Vets in Vans, Vet SOS, and Alameda County Behavioral Health. Raquel holds a master's degree in social work from UCLA and has expertise in motivational interviewing, crisis intervention, cognitive behavioral therapy, and program design. She is known for creating supportive environments for both staff and clients, and for her commitment to advocating equity, dignity, and compassion in the field of animal welfare. Wow. Yeah, and Raquel, you're getting some chat, love in the chat. That is an amazing bio. Please join me in welcoming Raquel. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be back. So yeah, I'm Raquel. I'm our veterinary social worker at the Alameda Animal Shelter. We're a small shelter with a government contract, and we're a nonprofit in the Bay Area. And um, one of the biggest lessons I've learned in my at sort of like the nexus of animal welfare and social work is that isolation is something that is pretty pervasive in our field. Um, and it doesn't just affect the animals we care for, it affects the staff. It affects the volunteers and our clients, and me too. The place where I started with sort of doing a deep dive into this subject was with myself. I was really noticing that um, I was feeling isolated, and I've gone in and out of feeling isolated in my role, both as a veterinary social worker, because often we are the only ones in our role in our organizations. Unless you're lucky enough to have several of us, but usually we're the only ones. And then also being a person in animal welfare can be isolating amongst, a typical friend group, in your family. Not everybody comes from a lineage of animal welfare workers. So I think a lot of misunderstanding can happen about our roles out in the world. And so yeah, we can feel just both isolated at our workplace and sort of outside. And I've been thinking about sort of what are the drawbacks of that? What are the consequences of that? And so one of the ways that I always sort of in my life, when I start to feel something really strongly individually, it's important for me, and my social justice background really taught me this, to zoom out and look at what are the sort of bigger factors at play when I start to feel like something is really only sitting on my shoulders, when I start to feel like people don't understand me, or when I feel like what I have to say isn't sort of even comprehensible. And so I start to zoom out. And that's really what I want to focus on today. So we're going to start with just looking at some facts and figures about isolation. So thanks so much, Charlotte. Next slide. So, the research sort of shows and supports that we can feel burnout, we can feel sort of these stressors that can lead to isolation. So in 2024, there was a study published that shelter staff have much higher levels of anxiety, anger, depression, and fatigue than the general population. I don't think any of this is super new information for all of us, but just to sort of like couch our discussion here. Another study in the same year found that high job demands combined with low resources predicted exhaustion, disengagement, and a desire to leave the job. And then there's also real heavy emotional burdens that shelter workers carry. And because oftentimes our work is really under-resourced from the community at large, that can translate into each of us not getting sort of the support we need um, in a shelter setting. I also just want to name that the research also says that although a lot of us in our roles, we feel sort of high compassion fatigue, there's also a, a statistic that shows that we have a lot of sort of wonderful feelings about our job. So there's like capacity and um, real signs of people feeling joy when they interact with, the reason that we all join this job, when we see pets go home with their people, when we see, all of our work in caring for a sick animal, come to fruition when they're healthy on the other side. There's real joy in our work, but some of the day-to-day aspects of our work can be draining. So next slide. This also impacts our volunteers. So we see that, volunteers can also report burnout. They can think about quitting their roles as volunteers. And when we're sort of feeling these sort of harder, more vulnerable feelings, then we can experience isolation as a result of that. So when volunteers feel isolated, this can affect retention, continuity, and overall strength of the shelter community. So supporting volunteers with connection, recognition is just as essential as supporting staff. Hopefully not new information for folks. Next slide. So this other thing, and I really loved how this was highlighted at our big conference in Vegas, at some of the various presentations that were there. So one of the big things that shelter staff face is this idea of moral injury, and it's this sense of being, bearing witness to things or having to do things that sort of conflict with our values. And so that can be like really witnessing the trauma of difficult cases and the constant exposure to secondary stress from the public, and the toll is really heavy. And just as a testament to like the resiliency of the people who are making up the shelter staff, the animal welfare staff, our staff and volunteers are at higher risk of PTSD than the general population. Um, for veterinary social workers, we're sort of looking at all ends of the spectrum in terms of witnessing and sort of bearing and absorbing the emotional toll of the work. We're supporting staff, we're supporting clients, and this means holding a lot of grief, anger, and stress of many groups at once. So when we talk about burnout or isolation, we need to understand that it's not just about being tired, it's about carrying trauma, about needing systems of care that acknowledge the depth of what shelter staff and volunteers are asked to hold. And so all of this information is probably familiar. We already feel this in our bodies, and again, at the same time, shelter work is deeply rewarding, but it carries a risk. It carries a risk of burnout, disconnection, and isolation. Next slide. So again, sort of just more of what more of this piece about isolation drives burnout. And yeah. Next slide. So when we think about what is really sort of driving the isolation, it's not really about our personalities, it's about the structures. So chronic underfunding pushes us into survival mode. Teams can often work in silos because there's not enough time for staff to really collaborate, plan, debrief. Bureaucracy really pulls us away from the mission, and things like, when we don't totally understand our documenting systems, or we don't really have one, we have to triple document across various platforms. Just the time and admin that takes really can take away from moments that we could be collaborating or creating or systematizing something so it's streamlined better. And then there's this piece about the passion trap. I'm wondering if anybody's heard of that. And I think this happens a lot in nonprofits, just sort of across the board, where staff blame themselves for burning out when in reality, there's all these systemic factors driving it. And sort of like the feel can be like everybody's sort of drowning alone and the collective impact of under-resourcing and isolation. And so it's really important that we understand that these aren't individual failings, they're structural conditions. There's more animals out there often than there is the staff or the resources to support it. So even though we're coming in with all of our heart and working overtime, staff, taking animals home, things like that. We have the knowledge, we have the passion, it's all there. But what happens if it's sort of more than what each of us individually can offer? So that's when we have to really think of structures. So next slide. So I want to share a story, sort of where all of this for me was really coming from. I work at a very small shelter in the Bay Area, and we are, we're doing our best to, raise money and be thrifty and spend money where it's important, but also really try to not spend money so that we can um, really have the resources to support like our very core programs. And so there's not a lot of extra resources for us to use, but that's why a piece of this was so important for me. So um, I was asked to join a back to school event at a housing collaborative. And I was planning to bring pet food and information about our services. When the thrift store manager, we have a thrift store, both a boutique sort of thrift store called the Thrifty Kitty and the Diggity Dog thrift store, which is newer. It's less boutique, it's more affordable. And the manager offered to join me to help to promote the opening of our new store, the Diggity Dog. And once we were there, we realized at the event that he could bring racks of human items, clothes and supplies for families that needed it. So from that small beginning, our collaboration grew, and now we're preparing to open a second food bank. So this offering will be during the week, whereas our original one was at the shelter and it's during the weekend. Not everybody can get to that. Um, and there was something about being at the Diggity Dog that sort of changed me, just real somatically, like in my body. As I worked at the thrift store to sort of prepare for this food bank that's coming up, I realized that I wanted to be in this space. Also talking to clients felt really differently. People would come in and have questions about, affording vet care and affording pet food and these various pet related things. And so I'd come out from working in the back to talk to people, refer them to our programs, and even talking with people felt um, really different from when people come to ask for services at the shelter. And so that's when I realized like spacing is really important when folks come to the shelter, not for a happy adoption, but maybe for an owner surrender or to talk about, look for resources because perhaps somebody's in a crisis. Um, there's a lot that we do to sort of meet people where they're at, especially when somebody is in a crisis. But I think there's also this stressful feeling about being in shelter. We know that the animals are there, it's very loud, because our shelter is set up in a way where there isn't a lot of space to talk, or for humans to just meet. It's really just set up for people to meet animals and then sort of leave. But at the thrift store, people we sort of all understand our how we want to take up our roles when we're suddenly in a store. Like we're all choosing to be there. There's sweet music playing in the background. It's a very calm, sort of simple, straightforward environment. Um, And yeah, there was something about that that was really interesting. So I noticed that um, because of that, it was just easier to connect with people and to talk more naturally. So then one day, this sort of collaboration grew, and it took on sort of like this deeper meaning for me. A client of mine who was unhoused and whose cats were in emergency boarding came to visit these cats at the shelter straight from the hospital. He was still in his hospital gown, and when he was there, he collapsed shortly after arriving. We had called an ambulance. I went to the hospital, stayed with him. I worked with his housing coordinator to make sure that there was housing at least for that night. And I realized, it was, I thought I was like, well, we have a thrift store. I think before he goes, it would be great if we could, if I could go over there and just pick up some things for him. Um, And actually, the thrift store manager, went an extra step and just brought us a duffel bag of clothes. And when I handed this off to our client, he was really grateful, but he was also really surprised that sort of all of this came together from the veterinary social worker who's helping him with his cats. Um, and I think I mean, I think he said he felt really supported, but honestly, I felt incredibly supported too. I felt like I wasn't carrying this situation on my own. Um, and one of the things that I think is really important about this is that the thrift store manager has a very big role, a lot of stressors, and we sort of all struggle with how do we make everything fit in the 8 hours that we're there at work each day. But I think it's important to name that the stressors are different. When you're working at the animal shelter and hands-on with animals, that's a different kind of stress than maybe the thrift store manager is handling at the thrift store. And so when I'm thinking about how this example really unlocked capacity, I'm thinking about how we we found a way to support one another and really deepen our impact in sort of various ways. Um, that wouldn't have been possible had we been working in our silos at 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 FAAS, Friends of Alameda Animal Shelter. So I have a question for everyone, and I'm wondering, where is the spot at your work, or in your life? And we asked this question earlier, and I'm so glad that this was the main question that was asked. But where do you feel most connected? Where do you feel the energy of connecting, hearing, and dialoguing? What location is that in your job? And if you do have a place, that I'm so grateful that you have that and you know that already. And if that place isn't necessarily coming to mind, then what are the conditions that you could create to make a space like that? Thank you. Next slide. So, I think it's important to also name that collaboration isn't the only way to reduce isolation. Um, Sometimes it's little things, sort of like team huddles at the start or end of shifts, rotating heavy responsibilities so no one carries all the hardest jobs by themselves, um, routinely supervisors checking in with people. Um, and it's not always about talking either. Sometimes it's about stepping outside. I heard a lot of people at the beginning saying that somewhere outside is where they feel like they can take a breath, they can take a moment to themselves and sort of realign with their body's needs. Being under a tree, feeling the sunlight on your face, and research really supports that. Um, And there's also another time when isolation tends to grow, and that's during the time of transitions. And I have this book. I'm not sure. I hope you can see it. It's by William Bridges, and it's called Transitions. And it's really looking at the psychology of what happens to us internally when we're adjusting to a big change, which is something that's external to us, something that you can name on a calendar. That's a change. But the transition of catching up to that change is the internal process that that each of us go through when there is an external change. And so if we're talking about the shelter environment, there are changes happening all the time. Probably, I don't have the stats on this, but I think change happens in a shelter more often than most other fields. We're talking about animals leaving, animals coming in. Because of the rate of burnout, there's staff turnover, there's volunteer turnover. And so we're seeing all these changes happen. And what is our internal experience when everything is changing? So this feeling of isolation can really happen during times of transition. For our shelter, we have a lot of change and transition happening. It's not all negative. We're opening a spay neuter clinic, which we're all very excited about. We have a new CEO who's wonderful, and really engaged with each of us, each of the staff members, and volunteers, and that's been a wonderful experience, but it's a big change. So what William Bridges says is that when we're sort of in this experience of change, we're in this sort of neutral zone where we're in the in-between space after an ending happens, but before we're really all caught up to this new beginning, this new way of being. So we can see how like we're having to adjust and make new routines all the time if we're sort of always in this place of transition. And if we're all sort of just catching up all the time, this can really fuel this feeling of isolation. So what we can do as an antidote is really provide information, clear, honest communication, even saying to people we don't know what you know all of the answers are during this time of transition, but we'll keep you updated. That sort of check-in and being super straightforward and clear and transparent helps people feel connected. They're thinking, oh, I'm not crazy. We just don't have this information yet. Oh, I'm not crazy. We just, that leadership hasn't made a full policy yet. So it's important to think of, in my opinion, it's important to really sort of track how many changes staff and volunteers are always going through, because that can be the place of isolation. And the things that we can do is not offer less information, but offer more. Next slide. So I think that it's also important as we're zooming out, to think of isolation as sort of contagious, that it can really sort of feel like this individual experience, but really what can happen in our inside of us, in our organizations, and then in our societies, is that when we feel isolated, we collaborate less, we duplicate work. And the people who suffer the most when we're not really being collaborative are the people that we serve and the animals that we serve. And so part of what really can help with the isolation piece is finding ways to connect with ourselves, but also connect with each other. And there are ways to do that that aren't about solely needing the funding to hire 70 new people, though I think we'd all love that. But part of it can be creatively sort of coming together with the resources that you already have. And this connection that we now have with the thrift store has just unlocked not just capacity, but also creativity and excitement in a way that I hadn't expected. And it's really important for me that we name that rest is resistance. Trisha Hershey's beautiful book about rest not being selfish, but a form of sustaining ourselves in systems that demand that we run ourselves into the ground. And I'm curious, for everyone in this room, was there a moment last week when your internal voice was saying, keep pushing even though you're tired, you can do this one last thing, even though you told yourself you were going to be home or go make dinner at this time, and then you didn't, or what's your version of that? Because that's mine. So rest is really about slowing down to see the world as it is and imagining the world that it can be. How can we imagine a better world for ourselves, for our communities, if we're constantly sort of in grind mode? How can we really listen to people or connect if we're constantly in grind mode? And so when I choose to rest, when I choose to sort of take more moments to listen to myself, I can listen to other people better. And as a veterinary social worker, that's exactly my job. That's my role, and I have to be present for that. So burnout is widespread. Isolation fuels it. Think about where you can connect to your creativity so you can reimagine roles, partnerships. Celebrations are also helpful to sort of mark the ending of a transition and the beginning of a new beginning. So celebrations, rituals, that's why those things are important, because changes, can really sort of throw us, but rituals and celebrations, we had recently a celebration sort of marking the end of kitten season. It was funny because there is no end to kitten season, but we got together anyways and threw a frisbee around in the park. The staff did, and we had a potluck. And that night I took 3 bottle babies home, which is so funny. So anyways, we're all a work in progress. But we don't have to carry this work alone, and we don't have to carry this work in a way that makes us feel isolated from even ourselves. So really, I think a big part of our work is finding how we can stay connected to ourselves, and whatever silly or sweet thing that is for you, that's sacred and important. So questions to think about. What's one small step that you can take this week to reach out instead of pulling away? How does isolation show up in the organizational or community level in your work? Where do you see silos that could be bridged between departments, between shelters, between animal welfare and human services? Yeah, that's I think so much of how we can be ourselves, be more ourselves, and also be seen and valued for the really important work that we do every day. So thank you, everyone. That's what I have. I'm really open to questions.
Thank you so much, Raquel. We so appreciate that and had so much good information. I made so many notes. I want to start by saying, and this is very important, one thing you may not know about there is a Maddie's Fund team part that loves thrifting, and the Alameda Animal Shelter's thrift stores are amazing. So if you're ever in the Bay Area, highly, highly recommended. But that's not what this call is about, but I had to plug that. But thank you, Raquel. You're getting so much love in the chat.
Oh, good.
If you have questions for Raquel, please drop them in the chat and we'll share them with her. But I wanted to highlight something you said real quick. Rest is about slowing down to see the world for what it is and what it could be. Can we all just rest and sit with that for just a minute? Right? I'm a very move on to the next thing. We got to go. Talking very fast, moving very fast person. But like, I love that. Let's all like keep that for today. We did have a really good question in the chat that I'd like to bring up. And this one says, as a volunteer, I concentrate on at times on poor management of one of our shelters, but I don't think about what the staff is going through. I never realize the level of stress and anxiety and fatigue that they may go through. How can volunteers universally acknowledge what staff may go through when we don't know what the full jobs, when we don't know the full jobs that they do?
Um, what a beautiful and compassionate reflection.
So self-aware, right? And it's so not us versus them. It's like, how can we all help each other?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes both ways. I don't think that staff always know everything that volunteers are going through, and I think that part of it is about, do we know our volunteers' stories, or does does our staff does the vol do the volunteers know the staff stories? Do you all know why I got into this work? Do we have a moment where we can like really share the visceral moment that we decided animal welfare was going to be part of our everyday lives? And
Ooh.
those points of connection are vital to understanding like who are the resources in and around me every day that I can, we have these human connections. And some of it is intentional. Staff don't want to share every bit of what's stressful with volunteers, because it can be painful. It can be painful to share, that we don't have enough resources, that I'm pulled in 5 different directions as a staff member. And I think that more moments where we can sort of slowly introduce ourselves as people, and then maybe get to the points where we can offer feedback, that's uplifting ultimately, and it doesn't feel just like criticism because we know each other better. I think that's a part of it.
And I think when you were telling the story about the thrift store and working with the people on your team who are working at the thrift store and how that came together to help one of your clients with human resources, and how you had you had the items, the thing that person needed, you had the connection, and then you could go from there. I thought that was a really beautiful representation of that. And you could take that to not just in staff members, but volunteers and even like the members of the public too, right? I think we get really siloed in that, and we say, oh, the thrift store couldn't possibly know what we're doing because they're dealing with donations and t-shirts and furniture all day. Well, I'm here in intake dealing with sad people and have to surrender their animals, or people that I don't want to deal with because they are bad people for surrendering their animals, right? Like you get into your mentality, and then the thrift store is thinking, well, I'm here in the thrift store with all this furniture, and what am I going to do about it, right? And you don't know what the other team is going through until you like connect on that. I think that is a really great illustration of the question asked.
Mm.
And I also love the thing you talked about the idea of celebrations to end a transition, because it's just a great timestamp. It's a good milestone. It's a good way to bring everybody back together. Someone also mentioned team huddles, which I think you could include volunteers in as well. I'm a big fan
Good
of
point.
that. Um, And my background is in restaurants. That was like my career before animal welfare. So I think of like pre-shift meetings. And I also think of front of the house, back of the house. Like you have your servers and your bartenders, but then you have the kitchen. And how could the kitchen possibly know what we're going to? How could the servers? And then you just gotta get together and figure it out because you're all trying to reach the same goal.
Mm-hmm.
We also had a really great question from Patty that says, how does your team document the reimagined roles, partnerships, and celebrations so 1 to 2 can come to fruition? So anything that's changing, how do you document that so those things can actually happen? So someone comes up with a great idea, but how do you get that rolling?
Yeah. I think that every shelter is, and every workplace is different with how we manage changes. And I think that, you know, there's pluses and minuses for being sort of a newish role in animal welfare, veterinary social worker. And also, and the cons are like I can feel isolated in my role because there's only one person in this role. But the other thing is that it gives me some flexibility because, I can I'm sort of like we're sort of always sort of creating this role, in how we're working with human social services. We're really sort of investigating what are the human needs that prevent people from accessing the care for their animals. And so that's a real sort of creative place to live in if you're taking care of yourself enough to access the creativity. And I think that what that means is, me and the thrift store manager, were able to sort of think outside the box because our jobs are sort of like that. And so we sort of plan this outside of, we this sort of like organically happened. Um, and I think a lot of it was about the oddness of our roles. And I think part of what we acknowledged sort of earlier on is that we could feel isolated or we could sort of come together and talk more. And I think after a lot of conversations, we realized how well this all fit. But it really took stepping outside of the daily grind of the shelter routine. And I recognize not all people can do that. Um, and I
For sure.
think some of that is like the structural pieces of what being in environments that are hard to connect in can really prevent us from connecting the dots to how we can work together. If that makes sense.
That makes absolutely good sense. And it sounds like culturally, your organization has recognized like the weirdness, right? Like you can make all the SOPs, you can make all the if-thens and all the flow charts, but at the end of the day, what happens is gonna happen, right? And I've worked at Bay Area animal shelters and you're gonna get a whole bunch of things and every day is gonna be different. And that's part of what makes it so amazing, but it also makes it really hard. But it sounds like culturally, your organization trusts you and trusts the manager of the thrift store enough to have the freedom to be flexible and to make flexible decisions. And that allowed you to have those connections, not stay in your lane, right? Like it was the flexibility and the autonomy to trust you to make those decisions with support from each other. And I think that's a really hard culture to create. But we've
Mhm.
got great ideas in the chat of how people are creating culture and limiting the isolation in their organizations. But
Oh,
it
I
sounds
love
like
that.
your organization has that as a core value, maybe not in writing, but in practice, and maybe in writing too. I think it's something to consider.
Mm.
I want to say real quick, there's one more really good question that I want to get to, but before we move on, when we were talking about understanding what's going on in different departments, Lisa Pierce shared the idea of behind the scenes tours. So I work in the spay neuter clinic, but now I'm going to go to the adoption center and see what's going on there. I'm going to go to the thrift store. Maybe I volunteer at a gala and see what our development is doing, depending on what your organization does. But going to different departments, having tours, seeing what those folks are actually working on. Um, I never thought animal control officers ever had it easy, but a ride along with an animal control officer is like life changing if you haven't done that. This is a great question and totally shifting gears, but Kimberly Chapman asks, and I also want to know the answer to this because I have a hard time with this one. How do I make sure I manage my shelter by not letting people take advantage of me and my love of helping? So, Kimberly, like to paraphrase, like, how do you say no when it's appropriate, but how do you keep that openness and the flexibility that allows for that collaboration? And Kimberly, if you have more to say, definitely put it in the chat because I do think this is a great question that a lot of us can hear from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sacred dance, of a
It
supervisor.
is.
Um, it's, really understanding, um, what somebody's asking for, sort of what's behind the ask. And supervisors, um, especially when we're feeling under-resourced, it can be really tough to feel like accommodating and ask, especially when it's going to take more resources away from the team. Um, that can feel really hard, and I really empathize with that. And it's a case by case situation. And I also think that staff are our most important resource
Mm-hmm. So we
than
do.
anything. It's sort of figuring out like, is this something that's just going on with this one person? Is it going on with multiple people? Um, sh the shelter environment, animal welfare environment, is legitimately taxing. So yeah, I wonder also if when we're feeling tired and like supervisors, if we feel like there's nowhere else to pull from except if somebody asks for an accommodation and I'm the one that has to step in and cover that and I have nothing left, but I have to do it because it's my role, then
Yeah.
there's a systemic issue there. And you feeling burnt out is something to listen to. It's not something to just shove down and then accommodate every request that you have to fill in for. Um, and this is not to say like we a lot of us struggle with that. And at some point, it's important that we collectively say, we can't sacrifice so much of ourselves if we want to stay in the game long term, because every staff turnover, every volunteer that's lost to burnout or isolation, that's another transition and change that people have to adjust to. And what is lost is not just, the tasks that you used to do, it's connection. It's the, institutional memory that you
Ouch. Yep.
carry, right?
That was exactly what I was just gonna say.
And every time we lose that and we have to start over, that that's that's something to grieve and lose. So anyways, I think I feel a lot of compassion for that supervisor in that moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think again, the idea of what the individual can do and what the system or the culture of the organization can do for sure is so important. Raquel, this was an amazing conversation. I feel like if you are on this call, I hope you feel seen because I do. I feel like Raquel may be working in a very different place than you, in a very different environment than you, but I hope she made you feel as seen as I do as someone who works and does this work and loves doing this work. Thank you so much. And thank you on this call, you with your chat. You made this so easy. You made it such a good discussion and shared your knowledge with us. Raquel will be available on Maddie's Pet Forum throughout the week to continue the discussion. So please feel free to post more questions there. And I know we're almost at time, but please let's continue this conversation on Maddie's Pet Forum with a reflective question. Where in your work do you see isolation showing up, and what small act of collaboration could begin turning that into connection? Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Sheila, I know we got 1 minute left. I told you I am very talky. How did we do? Anything else to say?
You were perfect as my co-host, Amber. Thank you so much. And everyone, Amber will be joining me again in November. So very much looking forward to that. And Raquel, thank you so much for this important conversation. I think this is a great topic, and I definitely hope folks join us on the thread on Maddie's Pet Forum to continue, because I think there's some great suggestions in the chat and just a lot of ideas and reflections brewing. So let's meet there with the reflection question. And next week, we have a presentation on keeping families and pets together with Garrett Parsons, the Pet Support Director of Found House. So another wonderful community conversation. And if you're interested in hosting or speaking, or you have a topic you'd like to learn about, please let me know. Share it on our suggestions thread on Maddie's Pet Forum, and we'll drop that link in the chat as well. But thank you all. This was so meaningful and thoughtful. I really appreciate your time, Raquel, and thank you so much, Amber.
Universal Zoom Wave, goodbye. Thank you, everyone.